So good evening, everybody. Thank you, Natasha. I'm very glad to be here in this wonderful house to be discussing another wonderful house, the house built by Konstantin Melnikov for himself and his family in a little back alley of the center of Moscow, in a neighborhood called Arbat, which is one of the oldest areas of Moscow and one of the oldest surviving areas of Moscow, as probably you're aware of that Moscow almost completely vanished in the 1812 fire. 2 centuries ago. Arbat is still an old area of Moscow in which, in a small alley, one discovers a completely unconventional building. So I will not discuss completely this building today, or rather not devote my discussion to this building only, but try to frame it in the life of Konstantin Melnikov, who was by all means an extremely interesting and extremely complex architect. Melnikov, I had the fortune of visiting this house for the first time when I was literally a kid. This was, or at least a young man. I had completed my architectural degree probably a month before. It was July 1973, and I discovered I had good reasons to be interested in Melnikov. I knew I had learned some Russian at school. I was interested in the question of the Russian avant-garde, and I discovered a house which was at that time hidden by very dense foliage in the small Krivo-Arbatsky Pereulok, in this small alley of Moscow. And in the house, July 1973, Konstantin Melnikov was still living. So my first visit to the house, and this is a slide I shot in July 73 of Melnikov discussing the house, I had the luck to be taken by him, not without difficulties. And I must tell a little story. My first contact was totally disastrous with him. I rang the bell, and Melnikov came out and said, "What do you want, young man?" And I said, I have a passion for Russian constructivism, and I want to see your very famous house." And Melnikov answered very, very valiantly, "I've never been, I'm not, and I will never be a constructivist. Bye-bye, young man." So, total mistake. And it's true that he had never been a constructivist, but I still had this sort of vague perception of a Russian avant-garde before, of course, teaching my way through it, learning my way through it, and teaching it also. And so I rang again and said, "Konstantin Stepanich, your house is world famous. We in Paris still remember your pavilion of the 1925 exposition. Please let me see your house." So in the end, he opened the door, and we spent an afternoon together, had seen the building, and I remained after his death following year in 1974. He was then 84 years old. He had been born in 1890. So after his death, I remain in good contacts, in particular with his son Victor. But let's now move to Melnikov's life. Here we see an early drawing he made when he was studying at the Moscow Gymnasium for architecture, painting, and sculpture. Melnikov was absolutely not born in the Russian well-to-do society. He was the son of a peasant. He started his life delivering milk in Moscow, then working as an intern in an engineering firm, the boss of which sent him to the school. So Melnikov, and this is very important if one wants to understand not only his own house but his architecture, didn't have a bourgeois background. He didn't have a gymnasium, a classical education. He taught himself into architecture by following the gymnasium and working with a series of architects and engineers. He worked, for instance, with the engineer Lolite on the Moscow automobile factory called AMO, nothing to do with Rem Koolhaas. He worked on the AMO factory, and then he started to work on a series of projects in the very early years of Bolshevik regime. Melnikov was never a member of a Communist Party. This is very important because as we'll see, his career, his life will be heavily inflected by the political developments in Russia. He was very young at the time of the revolution. But he was not an active revolutionary. He was not politicized. He took part to the early steps of the architectural production of the new regime and designed a series of buildings. What you see on the left is a housing scheme for the Vasilievka Hospital in Moscow. On the right, an interesting project for a prefabricated house using wooden components. From his background working with engineers, Melnikov was someone who was always interested in the materiality of constructions, in the engineering of construction, without being a fanatic of concrete or steel like many modernists. He was using structure in a more pragmatic way and trying constantly to work with the vernacular culture of construction in the Soviet Union. He comes to the surface, he emerges as an innovative architect in the very early 1920s, after having worked on the first general plan for the new Moscow, a plan developed under the leadership of an architect called Alexei Shushev, who was one of the great figures of the profession. This is not coincidental. Melnikov's fate and, in a way, his ability to survive a regime was due to the fact that although he was a loner, although he never belonged to any seriously, except episodically, to any architectural organization, he was protected by powerful people in the profession, who in a way prevented him from having problems. So, and one of these people was Shushev, who was one of the big shots in the Moscow profession until the 50s. So 1923, this is the first housing project in a competition for workers' housing neighborhood. And you see two aspects of this project. The sort of dynamic plan, which is characteristic of the work of Melnikov, not a block like the other competitors, but a sort of very dynamic fan-shaped system in which then the houses are located at an angle in order to get the best possible sunlight. And you see the interior of the dwellings, which have two floors and are really very interesting, integrated, compact little maisonettes. The elevation shows you the relationship between the various buildings and the centerpiece, which is a workers' club. This project was nicknamed as the SO, because it has a sort of sawtooth profile. And here you see the interior, lovely drawing of the interior with its furniture. This is important if you will think later of the house he built for himself. Melnikov, as you see, was not designing boxes, but was really interested in all the tiny aspects of domestic life, also in this early project. Here is one of his most striking project of the period. Another competition is held for a building located on a very small lot. It's the Moscow branch of the Communist Party newspaper Pravda. And the building by Melnikov is a sort of machine based on a kinetic principle. On this very small lot, every floor, all the floors are the same ones, they're mounted on a sort of central pivot and rotate in space. So the building is a constantly changing system on which we see also the use of slogans, the use of various types of political slogans, the use of numbers, the constantly changing visual information. So a very important building because it's the first one in which Melnikov includes very consistently movement as the central feature of the movement of the building. Melnikov was also a painter, and he belongs to the category of architects who cannot be considered as first magnitude painters, but for whom the painting studio is a key channel towards architectural design. And here we see two of his self-portraits. He will later in his life continue to teach painting and earn a meager life in the later years by doing so, by teaching painting. But what will really change his position and give him a certain centrality on the Russian scene, and what will allow for the construction of his house, will be a series of 5 workers' clubs built in Moscow between 27 and 30. At first, he loses a competition for the Zuyev club, the club of communal workers. But I want to show you this losing design because it's an interesting system of cylindrical elements. You see here the plan, a series of cylinders. One is the entrance, the other one is the theater, another one is a zal, is a room open for all sorts of uses. And you see here this amazing section. That so this building is was not built, and Golosov built it, and then Melnikov won the competition for this one and built 4 other clubs. This one is called Rusakov, was the club of streetcar workers of Moscow, and as you see, it's an extremely expressive structure. You understand from the street that it's a very peculiar building with its base here and its podium here, and the 3 different types of rooms here protruding, cantilevering over the streets. Here we see the plan with the sections, and the cones of visibility, the very steep flights of rows, of seat rows, and the idea was to be able to transform the building, to have one option with a very small room for the audience, closing off these little rooms, and of course the ability of having many more people. What is interesting is the complete focusing on the question of visibility in the project. So here we see vintage photos of these flights of seats. We see here the point where the vision converges. A second one is built for a shoe factory. It's called Bureviesnik, and it's also a very remarkable structure. We see here the drawing with the main building and this curious tower in which we find the various rooms used for club activities. Here is a view of the building in the 80s. And we see, this is an abominable slide, but we see the plan, the idea of putting a swimming pool in the base of a building, in the end not built, and having a big flexible auditorium here, which in fact will be will have the ability of being divided into various sections, and this flower-shaped tower with a detail of the building maybe 15 years ago. Another one again, in the family of the Rusakov Club, is built for the China factory in the city of Dulyevo, not far from Moscow. We see the plan. The plan is almost anthropomorphic with head, arms, and legs. This one is another one. It's number 4, built for the factory called Svoboda, or Freedom, and it has a very remarkable and different shape. It's almost a cylinder. We see here a sketch by Melnikov. Again, the entry is a spectacular, promises to be a very spectacular experience, coming up these flights of stairs into this large cylinder. Here is a reconstruction. Here is a detail of this building. And the last one is called Caoutchouc, was for the workers of the chemical industry, and leads us to the house because it is a cylinder. We see here the perspective, and the building as it got built. This sort of first cylinder with the entrance to the ground floor and the stairs, and the second cylinder in which the auditorium is located. Here we see the plan, again, the entry kiosk, the building itself, the sports facilities which are connected to the theater itself. And here we see the details of the building, which was transformed into a sort of casino in the last times. Okay, another one yet, the Frunze Club, is probably less interesting, but it is connected to the shapes we had seen in the Majorca, in the tobacco pavilion. Probably this factory had less money and could not indulge in such heroic shapes as the others. So what is important here is to understand the relationship between the campaign of club construction and the house. Melnikov simply was an architect who had money in Moscow in the second half of the 20s, and he was an exception. The architectural profession was not fully nationalized or transformed into a state system or public system. There were still free architects, free professionals. Melnikov was working almost alone, and he had made a lot of money with his clubs and was able to negotiate, thanks to his highly placed protectors, a building permit in the center of Moscow. The house of Melnikov remains the only house built during 40 years of Soviet regime in the center of Moscow. No other person has ever been able to build a house for his or her family. It's a total exception because of all of these factors. So we have to view it that way. And here we see Melnikov in his Gastinaya in the big room, which was the main living room of the house. And you see on the wall that he had the panels that had been made to revive his Paris pavilion in the 1960s in Moscow, and that he was very proud of them. Okay, so the story begins with studies that go back to early ideas in the 1920s, the idea of a circular house with a stove in the middle. The stove is very important, and this takes us back to the peasants' origins of Melnikov. A stove, Russian izbas were heated with stoves, and Melnikov was very good at building stoves and made also some money during the hard years by building stoves for other people in Moscow. So here the idea is to have a cylinder with a stove in the center, an early idea for a house. When he developed his house, he dropped the idea, but he kept the principle of cylindrical structures. And you see here a vintage model in which we start understanding how the house works. The house is based on the intersection of a higher and a lower cylinder, between the two of which the different rooms are located. On the ground floor, we find the entrance, the kitchen, the dining room, private rooms for where the kids would later work, a room for Anna Gavrilovna, the wife of Melnikov, and also storage room, as there was no storage in the upper floors. Here we see the little helicoidal stair taking us to the second floor, to a first floor, second in Russian and in American terms, where we find the Gastinaya, the big living room, and the bedroom. I will go back later. And then, in the upper part of the higher cylinder, we find the studio, which has these extraordinary lights, as we'll see. But I'm very quick because I guess this will be discussed in the movie. This is an interesting plan. It's the same plan, but in the version of the building permit, which was to be found until several years ago. It has vanished since in the Moscow building archives. The section shows us how this level are differentiated. The ground floor is continuous, and then we have a sort of intersection. The upper floor of the studio functions as a mezzanine, as a potential mezzanine, in arriving into the living room, and the flat roof here generates a little mezzanine into the studio. Here we see exteriors of the house in the 1920s. The building had an interesting structure. Nothing heroic. Again, Melnikov was not a fanatic of concrete and steel. He was building for himself with primitive materials. He used brick. And he used in particular these very interesting hexagonal openings that were an echo to windows that could be found in towers at the Kremlin that were undertaking renovation at the same time. So the tower, the white tower with the hexagonal windows, is not referencing the machine at all, not referencing modern times, but rather referencing Russian tradition. 124 such openings, openings, but many of them are tapped, are not visible. They're used for thermal insulation, or they generate cupboards in the inside. So they're not all of them are visible, although the wall is a continuous wall of hexagonal openings with, in fact, zigzagging vertical supporting elements. The studio has 38 such windows and gets, as you'll see, a very beautiful light. So here we have recent views, the one I've shown you before, a view shot several years ago. The building is in excellent condition. There are some cracks, but they have nothing structural. The cracks appear precisely where these hexagonal holes have been plugged. Very logically, that's where the stucco is cracking. And here we see one of the construction detail and the structure before it was completely filled. We see all the holes and the way in which they were traced by Melnikov in his construction drawings. The structure is really remarkable also if we look at the horizontal elements at the floors. 9 meters long beams that are high, what are 22 centimeters by 2.5, and here is Madame Melnikov emerging, or a construction worker probably, and we see then the manner in which the floor itself is mounted here. Very really a system made with extremely inexpensive components, bricks and small sections of wood that were available. And this is here another model showing us how the building opens and how these two cylinders operate together. Okay, in the interior we find interesting situations. Melnikov worked on the windows and designed 3 different ways of inserting wood into the windows. So the windows, in a way, created a pattern. And this is the small stair with a vertical axis made with one telegraphic pole covered with zinc leading to the top. The bedroom is a very intriguing space. The bedroom was common to the parents and the children. No divisions, only very low partitions between parents and children. I love this image, which seems to be referencing the famous Russian story of the little girl and the 3 bears, the big bear, the medium bear, the small bear. We have the medium cushion, the large cushion and the small cushion. The beds, interestingly, were not put on the ground. They were put on a sort of support, and this alluded to a sort of, what I would say, celebration of the value of sleep in the Melnikov family. Sleep was considered as a sort of almost ceremonial activity of the entire family, and the beds had to be floating to that aspect. So here we see the interior as it is more or less now. So this is the what used to be the living room and became the studio for Konstantin because his son had taken up the other studio on top. Here we see the presence of the higher cylinder into the lower one. Here is another view. We see the large window facing the alley, and here again this geometrical intersection, and the oven designed by and built by Melnikov, which has a strange suprematist Malevich-like take. And it's very efficient. Oh, again the same? No? No. So this is the upper floor and the studio space, which has this extraordinary light, as you can grasp here, thanks to the 38 windows. And you see also here a variation on the woodwork in the various windows. Here is a view of a small mezzanine. Again, it is the roof of a lower cylinder on which Melnikov used to sit and draw. And I think that all these aspects are really interesting and also very fragile from the point of view of restoration, a question I will discuss later. But what is touching here in the house is precisely that it has still all the stains and the marks of use, and is not an embalmed building, over-restored building. It is still, and still is to this day, in its juice, as French antique dealers say. Here, two paintings by Victor Melnikov of a bedroom, which with the original yellow finish, which has been reproduced, and we see here the strange beds, how these beds were organized, and also the continuity of the windows on that floor. Okay, so that's the house. We'll learn more about it, and I will return to it at the end of this conversation. I just wanted to underline the importance of these cylindrical designs for some of Melnikov's later projects. Here is a project for a communal house for which Melnikov tries to get a patent, in which he uses again the principle of intersecting cylinders. This will never be built. Here is a variation on the theme. You see a system of cylinders which are clustered around here a main one in which the communal facilities are located, Dom Comuna. So what is common are the collective facilities, a library, a nursery, probably a dining room, and then the individual apartments are located in the other cylinders. And you see on this drawing that Melnikov has used as collaged photos of his house to legitimize his project. Melnikov participates at the end of the 1920s and until the mid-30s to a series of competitions, but will never again will almost never be able to build again. Some projects for public entities, but commissions very quickly lost. Competitions lost also, for instance, here with the pavilion for the 1937 exposition in Paris. Melnikov is slowly but steadily removed from the center scene, loses the control of his design workshop, and in a way, and survives only because of his painting skills, because of his ability to teach drawing to students applying to the Moscow Architectural Institute. He almost completely vanishes from the scene, and his name is only heard between 1940 and probably 1960, only heard when or read in books that are criticizing the excesses of avant-garde architecture. He re-emerges in the mid-50s. This is a project of the mid-50s for a pantheon to the death heroes. And we see that this time he's again working on the idea of analogy and metaphor, of course, the heraldics of the Soviet regime, the five-pointed star, is here the basis for his project. But his main activity during those years will be a sort of constant reminiscence of his heroic project. This is one of his late drawings, where we see put together the Rosakov Club and the Santo Domingo Memorial. Melnikov will make paintings and architectural drawings. He was, as of 1960, reinserted in his rights. He had been forced to retired. He was restored to his rights as a professor, but never really taught in Moscow, although he constantly received young people and in order to tell them his story. Here we see an important view showing the intimacy between Melnikov, Konstantin, and his son Victor, painter, who slowly took up, even before Melnikov's death, but essentially after his death, took control of the house and maintained the house and protected the house against all the bad currents and risks of late Soviet life. Here, his view of Melnikov in the lower floor dining room in the early 70s, a photo by French photographer Henri Cartier-Bresson. So the house has survived to this day, and has survived in a very conflictual environment. And this is my conclusion now. The conclusion here, I'm discussing the house, showing you the recent fate of the house, showing you a meeting of the International Committee for the Preservation of the Melnikov House, held in 2008 in the John Soane House and Museum in London. The last image is an interesting one. It's a model of the house shown of this sort of red rug at the John Soane meeting. What is fortunate is that the house is extremely sturdy, despite all the buildings that have been built around it, all the disturbance introduced into the ground, into the foundations. It's still standing and will probably stand for a long time. So the story is not over yet, and there is a complete stalemate as of now, but possibly something will emerge at some point. Another oligarch with money, culture, and good taste, or a mass uprising of Moscow architects wanting to preserve this jewel, or something else. Thank you.